In a move that sent shockwaves through global commodity markets, Beijing issued a sudden ultimatum that could reshape the balance of power in international trade. The announcement came without warning. China would immediately suspend all iron ore purchases from BHP, one of the world's mining giants. The order was direct and uncompromising. Even ships already loaded with Australian ore, making their long voyage toward Chinese ports, now faced the real risk of being turned away upon arrival. Hidden within this dramatic suspension, however, was a proposal just as significant. China extended what some viewed as an olive branch, and others as a challenge. Trade could resume, but only if transactions were settled in renminbi rather than US dollars. For a company whose lifeline depends so heavily on Chinese demand, the stakes couldn't be higher. In today's interconnected economy, few markets can match China's mix of massive scale and steady consumption power. The numbers paint a stark picture for BHP. Failing to reach an agreement with Beijing could mean losing its largest customer, with potential annual losses climbing to 30 billion US dollars. This raises questions that reach far beyond boardrooms in Melbourne. What does this moment mean for Australia's resource sector? And will Canberra be forced to accept new currency terms that challenge decades of dollar-dominated trade? If you're interested in the forces reshaping global economics and geopolitics, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned as we break down the key developments shaping our world. Today, we're diving into a story of resources, currency, and the quiet struggle for economic influence that stretches across continents. To fully grasp what's at stake, we first need to understand the global iron ore landscape and why Australia has held such a commanding position in this market for decades. When looking at the world's iron ore reserves, three nations stand out as heavyweights: Australia, Brazil, and China. Yet among them, Australia remains in a class of its own. The continent holds around 51 billion tons of economically viable iron ore, more than 28% of the world's known deposits. That's enough raw material to sustain global steel production for generations. But Australia's edge isn't just about volume. It's about quality. Its ore is among the highest grade in the world, meaning more usable iron per ton of rock extracted. Another key advantage is geography. Australia's resources are concentrated, not scattered, making extraction simpler and large-scale operations far more efficient. Compared to many global deposits, Australia's geology presents fewer technical challenges and lower production costs. Nowhere is this advantage clearer than in the Hamersley Basin of Western Australia's Pilbara region. This vast, rust-colored landscape has become synonymous with iron ore on an epic scale. Against a backdrop of ancient rock and endless red earth, global mining titans like Rio Tinto and BHP have transformed the region into an industrial powerhouse. These aren't just mines, they're self-contained industrial ecosystems. Massive open-pit operations linked to private rail lines stretching hundreds of kilometers to coastal ports, where custom-built bulk carriers wait to ship the ore worldwide. The scale is staggering. Some trains stretch over 2 kilometers, carrying tens of thousands of tons in a single trip. Within this global market, one customer stands above all others: China. The numbers are astonishing. Roughly 83% of Australia's iron ore exports end up in Chinese ports, worth around 79 billion US dollars annually. To put that in perspective, iron ore accounts for about 65% of all trade between the two nations. In many ways, Australia's prosperity, and its mining sector in particular, rests on this single trade flow. For giants like BHP, China isn't just their biggest buyer, it's the only market that truly matters. But such heavy dependence creates both strength and vulnerability. This naturally raises an important question. If China has such vast territory and mineral resources of its own, why does it still import so much iron ore at premium prices? The answer lies in geology and economics. While China does have domestic iron ore deposits, most of them are low-grade, averaging only about 33% iron content, meaning just a third of every ton of rock is usable iron. By contrast, Australian ore from the Pilbara averages over 60% iron content, nearly double China's. This difference drastically impacts every stage of steel production, from transportation to smelting efficiency. On top of that, China's resources are spread across countless small and medium-sized mines, making extraction and logistics far more expensive and complex. When Chinese planners do the math, considering quality, processing efficiency, and transport, importing Australian ore still comes out cheaper than expanding domestic mining. It's a straightforward calculation that has shaped global trade policy for decades. Yet this relationship has seen its share of turbulence. At times, China has moved to cut its reliance on Australian ore, using its buyer power in ways that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. BHP, the Melbourne-based mining titan, has long held a privileged position as one of China's top suppliers. In 2024, it exported about $30 billion worth of iron ore to China alone. On paper, it's a win-win. Australia provides the resources China needs, and both sides profit. But that success also created a power imbalance. BHP's dominant market share gave it significant influence, not just over supply, but over pricing itself. As China's demand skyrocketed during its urbanization and infrastructure boom, BHP and other Australian exporters capitalized on their leverage. Prices rose steadily, drifting further from actual production costs. Analysts estimate that producing a ton of iron ore costs BHP around $20, yet sales to China often reach several times that figure. The resulting profit margins frustrated Chinese buyers, who felt they were being overcharged. But the dynamics went beyond market forces. They were geopolitical. To understand why Australian suppliers felt confident pushing prices so high, we have to look back to 2018, the year trade tensions between the United States and China first erupted. As tariffs flew and rhetoric escalated, nations around the world faced a difficult choice about where to stand. Australia's then Prime Minister Scott Morrison made his position clear. His government chose to align closely with Washington's stance toward Beijing, actively joining efforts to limit China's growing economic and strategic influence. This political position carried direct commercial repercussions. During this period, Australian suppliers began deliberately pushing iron ore prices higher. What industry observers witnessed was both remarkable and unsettling. The benchmark price for 62% grade iron ore soared from around $70 per ton to an astonishing $220. This wasn't a slow, natural market shift. It was a dramatic, rapid price surge that tripled costs in a relatively short time. To many, it appeared that Australian producers were treating iron ore not just as a commodity, but as a strategic instrument, a resource that could be used to apply economic pressure on China. The unspoken message was clear. Chinese buyers could either pay inflated prices or risk potential supply shortages. Beijing's reaction was predictable. No major economy, especially one with China's global ambitions and sense of national pride, would tolerate such dependency indefinitely. Policymakers in Beijing quickly recognized the underlying risk. Being overwhelmingly reliant on a single supplier, particularly one aligned with their chief geopolitical rival, posed an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. What followed was a masterclass in supply chain diversification. Between 2018 and 2022, China launched a deliberate, systematic campaign to reduce its dependence on Australian iron ore. The data speaks for itself. Reliance fell from 87% down to just 40%. This was no slow drift, it was a calculated pivot. Chinese buyers aggressively sought alternative sources, forging stronger ties with suppliers in Brazil, Africa, and other underutilized regions. Then came a political turning point in Canberra. In 2022, Australian voters elected a new government, bringing the Labor Party to power under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The incoming administration quickly signaled a change in tone toward Beijing. Instead of continuing Morrison's confrontational approach, Albanese's government called for stabilization, a diplomatic reset aimed at separating economic cooperation from security disputes. Both nations soon introduced measures to ease trade tensions and rebuild commercial normalcy. By 2024, the results were visible. Iron ore trade between the two countries had largely rebounded, with export volumes nearing the record highs last seen in 2017, before relations had deteriorated. International analysts interpreted this as evidence of a lasting thaw in China-Australia relations. The prevailing view was that both sides had embraced pragmatism, recognizing the shared benefits of stable trade. Then came the announcement that overturned all of those assumptions. On the final day of September 2025, Beijing issued a statement that stunned global markets. China declared the immediate suspension of all iron ore trade with BHP. This was no temporary pause or negotiation tactic. It was presented as final. The most startling aspect, however, was the condition for resuming trade. China made it clear that any future iron ore exports from Australia must be settled in Renminbi, not US dollars. The directive was absolute, leaving no transition period. Even ships already loaded and en route to China would fall under the new rule. At first glance, this seemed like a dispute over currency preference, another move in Beijing's long-standing push to promote international use of its currency. Many Western commentators dismissed it as just that. But this view misses the deeper strategy at play. China's real goal isn't simply to change the currency of payment, it's to reshape the power dynamics that have defined the global iron ore trade for decades. For over 20 years, China has been the world's largest iron ore buyer. Yet despite this immense purchasing power, it has often found itself on the weaker side of price negotiations. This imbalance has cost the Chinese economy billions each year. Take the current market, for example. The spot price of iron ore hovers around $80 per ton, reflecting real-time supply and demand. But China's long-term contracts with producers like BHP often lock in rates above $100 per ton. That $20 difference might sound small until you multiply it across 700 million tons of imports annually. The result, an extra $10 billion in costs every single year. A massive wealth outflow that Chinese policymakers have grown increasingly unwilling to tolerate. The underlying problem lies in the structure of the global iron ore market. Unlike markets with many competing suppliers, iron ore has long been dominated by a small group of producers, mainly from Australia and Brazil, giving sellers the upper hand. The dollar's dominance in global trade has reinforced this imbalance. By insisting on renminbi settlements, Beijing hopes to break this system and gain greater control over pricing mechanisms long dictated by others. This move is part of a broader strategic plan that has been years in the making. One of Beijing's most important steps was the creation of the China Mineral Resources Group, not just another state-owned company, but a complete overhaul of how China handles resource procurement. Previously, Chinese steelmakers negotiated independently, often competing with one another for supply. This fragmentation weakened their collective bargaining power and allowed suppliers like BHP and Rio Tinto to maintain pricing dominance. China Mineral Resources Group changed that equation entirely. By consolidating the procurement needs of China's major steel firms under one roof, the country effectively unified its buyers. Now, when China Mineral Resources Group sits across the table from BHP or Rio Tinto, it represents the entire Chinese steel industry. This unified front transforms market dynamics. Instead of competing against each other and driving prices up, Chinese buyers now act as one powerful counterparty, capable of rewarding cooperative suppliers and sidelining those who resist. Beyond that, Beijing's currency push ties into an even broader ambition: to internationalize the renminbi and gradually reduce US dollar dominance. Right now, Global commodity trade, especially high-volume markets like iron ore, remains one of the core pillars supporting the dollar's reserve status. Billions of dollars move through these markets every day, sustaining constant global demand for U.S. currency. China's insistence on Renminbi transactions challenges that structure directly. By pricing major commodities in its own currency, Beijing is effectively creating an alternative monetary sphere, one less exposed to American oversight or sanctions. This has a defensive purpose too. China has watched how the U.S. has weaponized dollar-based systems, using sanctions to cut off nations like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela from global finance. Renminbi settlement offers China a shield. Transactions processed through its own financial institutions are far harder for Washington to monitor or disrupt. As Beijing expands these financial channels, it's building resilience against potential future sanctions or economic coercion. Which brings us to the critical question: how much will this cost Australia? And more importantly, will companies like BHP agree to settle in Renminbi to preserve access to their most important customer? To understand the scale of risk, consider how dependent Australia's mining giants have become on Chinese demand. Recent data shows that roughly 60% of BHP's total revenue comes from China. That's not diversification. That's concentration at an alarming level. In 2024, BHP exported 250 million tons of iron ore to China, generating over $30 billion in revenue. When a single market represents such a vast portion of a corporation's income, vulnerability becomes unavoidable. The financial markets reacted instantly to Beijing's announcement. Within hours, BHP's share price fell by 3.5% to 4%, wiping nearly $39 billion off its market value in a single trading day. That kind of wealth destruction captures the attention of every shareholder and executive alike. If China were to permanently cut off iron ore imports from BHP, the impact would be catastrophic. Annual losses exceeding $30 billion, effectively erasing the company's entire Chinese income stream. No corporation, no matter how large, can absorb that without massive restructuring, layoffs, and a complete strategic overhaul. But this isn't just BHP's problem. The effects would ripple through the entire Australian economy. Western Australia, where most of the country's iron ore is mined, accounts for about 80% of total exports. The state's fiscal stability depends heavily on this trade. Roughly 40% of its revenue comes from mining taxes and royalties. Those funds aren't abstract numbers. They pay for schools, hospitals, roads, and essential public services. If exports to China were disrupted for long, the state's budget could plunge into crisis. Current projections suggest a potential deficit of $16.4 billion, a shortfall impossible to fix through simple cuts or efficiency measures. It would require either deep spending cuts, federal intervention, or both. The human cost would be equally severe. Australia's mining sector directly employs around 150,000 workers, most earning solid wages that sustain families and entire regional communities. Indirectly, the industry supports another 500,000 jobs across transport, equipment manufacturing, and services.